pillaging that a rebel Goth barbarian army can do before they simply run out of things to pillage. And so, as their food runs low and they don't have very good logistical supply, their army begins to fall apart. This buys the Eastern Roman Empire some time to start rebuilding. Of course, the first order of business is to bring in a new emperor, and so a man by the name of Theodosius I, is placed in command of the Eastern Roman Empire. And one of the first things that he does in almost standard Roman pompous rhetoric is to vow vengeance against the Goths. And he creates an army and he ventures forth to reclaim his territory. But what happens is basically 4 years of stalemated fighting. And so finally in 382, when Theodosius realizes that he's not getting anywhere and he's not able to throw the Goths off his land, he's forced to make a shift in his foreign policy. He allows the Goths and the Huns and the Trevengi and the Gruthungi and other groups to settle within Roman lands. He does this with the expectation that these groups will provide manpower for his army, but in the process, what he creates is a Hun toehold within the Roman Empire. Theodosius even goes so far as to have his own advisors come up with propaganda to justify to his people why he's allowing the barbarians to settle within Roman lands. This is a quote by a man by the name of Themistius, who was one of Theodosius' advisors. He states, and I quote, "For such are the victories of reason and humanity, not to destroy, but rather to improve the lot of those who are responsible for the suffering. Was it then better to fill the Danube provinces with the dead or with farmers, to make it full of tombs or of men, to travel through a wilderness or cultivated fields, to count up the number of slain or of those who work the land?" Unquote. This is obviously not the rhetoric of an empire in its best days. Let's make a comparison. Once in life, I recommend to all my listeners that they need to travel to Rome. This is a city that is replete with history and in my opinion is probably one of the most fun and exciting cities anyone can travel to in Europe. When you get there, go to the very heart of the city and near the Roman Forum, you're going to find a column that is dedicated to the Emperor Trajan. This is a monument that was built in the year 113 CE, and when you look at it closely, what you're going to notice is Trajan's army on the march. This is a victorious army. This is an army that appears strong and defiant. It shows an army moving into battle and destroying their enemy. This was a tribute to Emperor Trajan during what was known as the Dacian Wars, which was a time period when the Roman Empire was expanding and strong, and the peoples of those conquered lands were soon incorporated into the empire itself. To stare at this column is to stare into the very heart of Roman military glory. This, in my opinion, is a far cry from Theodosius, who just really couldn't seem to get the job done against the Goths and had to instead settle for a brokered peace instead. But perhaps I'm being hard on the guy. I mean, after all, he was a military leader. He was a general in the Roman army. He led several successful campaigns before he was elected as the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire. And it's this military background that's going to be needed very soon, because shortly after he becomes emperor, and by that I mean a couple of years, the Western Roman Empire starts to fragment. Most of the civil unrest begins in the year 383. The emperor of the West, Emperor Gratian, is assassinated, and shortly thereafter several usurpers attempt to claim the throne. The Roman provinces of Britain and Gaul break off and decide to elect their own emperor, and in the capital of the Western Roman Empire, a man by the name of Eugenius lays claim to the emperorship. This, of course, gives Theodosius the perfect excuse to raise an army and try to march west in order to reunite the empire, which is exactly what he does. But when he's raising this army, he quickly realizes that the forces that he has may not be adequate enough to do the job. And so he starts employing the Huns and the Goths, the same people that he had settled south of the Danube. Now, if you recount from earlier, he expected these people to provide manpower in the situation of war. And so they arise to the occasion, they join his army, and he marches to the west. Now, I'm going to save the details of this particular civil war. Granted to say that it did last for quite a bit of time, and it eventually culminated in the year 394 against Eugenius and his forces at a battle by the name of Frigidus. I want to emphasize the Battle of Frigidus because what happens at this battle sets into motion a series of events which eventually leads to our next milestone, another nail into the coffin of the Western Roman Empire. Again, the year was 394. Emperor Theodosius is marching into an area of modern day Slovenia. Most modern historians agree that this happened in the Vipava Valley. And as he marches into this valley, he sets up almost no reconnaissance. He doesn't send his scouts out to figure out what's going on, but he just kind of blindly marches into battle. He makes it a point to place his mercenaries at the very forefront of his army, particularly the Goths. He puts them just way up at the front. And when he attacks Eugenius and his army, he soon realizes that the position that he's attacking is almost completely impregnable. His forces are decimated, particularly the Goths who are at the front, and they suffer just horrendous losses. However, despite this setback, Theodosius is able to regroup his forces, and the very next day he sends them back into battle. Some historians go so far as to claim that he had some sort of divine wind that was blowing dust and smoke into the faces of his enemies and blinding them so his troops could be victorious. Either way, he wins. He manages to round up Eugenius and all his supporters and immediately puts them to death. And then shortly thereafter, he is able to reunify both the Eastern and Western Roman empires. His mercenaries, however, are extremely upset. They realize just how easily the Roman empires are willing to sacrifice their lives in order to achieve political and military goals, and in my opinion, rightfully so. One man in particular had a great deal of resentment. He was a leader of the Goths. He led approximately 20,000 of his fellow troops into this battle, and some historians claim that he had approximately 50% losses. To him, the Battle of Frigidus was not this unifying, glorious thing, but rather it was a bloodbath. My sympathy goes out to this particular man, because at this point in history, he was going to be kicked around a lot. He was kind of like that little kid on the playground that gets a lot of sand thrown in his face. But he was going to rise up beyond this point in life, and eventually he is going to accomplish something that no Goth, no Hun, nobody up until this point in history was able to do. His name was Alaric, and it's worth remembering because he really does set the next milestone in our story. But before we can get into Alaric or his accomplishments, we have to go back to Emperor Theodosius I and the aftermath of the Battle of Frigidus. Because you see, Emperor Theodosius I was the last man. He was the last emperor to rule over a united Roman Empire. But this rule was going to be very short-lived. A few months after the battle, in January of 395, he passes away. He dies in the city of Milan, which is the capital of the Western Roman Empire. And he makes the decision, and I was going to say mistake because this is, to me, a big-time mistake, but he makes the decision to divide the empire under the control of his two very young sons. This effectively ensures that there's going to be a power struggle between the Eastern and Western Roman empires. And this struggle is going to decide which side is going to go into decline and which side is going to make it. I'm going to take this time to apologize because this next part is going to be a little confusing. There's going to be a lot of names and dates, and for the sake of clarity, I tried to leave out as much minutia as possible. So to the die-hard historians out there that are wondering why I haven't put in every minute detail, that's why. The best method that I could come up with is going to be the following. If you take a piece of paper and you draw a line right down the middle of it, on the left side of the page is going to be the Western Roman Empire, and on the right side is going to be the Eastern Roman Empire. After Theodosius passes away, he places his son Honorius in charge of the West and his son Arcadius in charge of the East. But they're children, they're too young to effectively rule, and so regents and advisors kind of come into play, and they are truly the power behind the throne, so to speak. In the West, you have a man by the name of Stilicho, and in the East, you have a man by the name of Eutropius, who becomes Arcadius' closest advisor. The play for power begins in the West, which kind of held the initiative at the start. Stilicho pulls out a piece of paper which he proclaims to everyone was given to him by Theodosius on his deathbed, stating that not only was he meant to be regent of the Western Roman Empire, but also of the East. Now, this is something that the Eastern Roman Empire immediately states is a falsehood, and under the control of Eutropius, they completely reject him. Thus, you have the beginning of the division lines. Into this developing mess, we're going to be throwing Alaric. You can go back to that piece of paper and kind of stencil him in on the left side of the page because at this point he has just gotten done fighting for Theodosius. He's still in the Western Roman Empire. But Alaric and Stilicho do not come to terms. They're constantly kind of grinding heads, and eventually Alaric has had enough. In 395, he rebels, which leads to a series of military confrontations between him and Stilicho. But Stilicho gains the upper hand and effectively tosses Alaric out of the Western Roman Empire. So you can kind of go back to that piece of paper and cross him out on the left side of the page and draw him in on the right. The Eastern Emperor Arcadius and his advisor Eutropius immediately seize on this opportunity. They actually hire Alaric. Some claim they do this because they want to irritate the West, but as it just so happens, in the year 379, a group of Huns that were coming in off the Asiatic steppe. Now, these are not the same Huns that are nicely settled south of the Danube. They're actually a new wave of Huns. Again, there's this kind of impending wave after wave of Hun that's slowly moving its way across into Eastern Europe. This new group of Hun is hell-bent on pillaging and destroying everything in their path, and they make their way down through that strip of land between the Black and the Caspian Sea into what is present-day northern and central Syria. The Roman emperor and his associates realize that Alaric just simply wants a piece of land, which is a lot better than these Huns who are just kind of coming in to pillage and destroy everything in their path. So Alaric is given the contract. He is sent out after the Huns, and he is told to kick them out. He's actually very successful with this. In fact, in the year 398, he accomplishes exactly that. He sends the Huns packing. But of course, it's not Alaric who receives any type of commendation for this. It's Eutropius. He's brought back to Constantinople to a triumph. And Alaric and his men are kind of, for the most part, forgotten. In fact, it gets so bad that in the year 401, Arcadius, again the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, who is now no longer just a child, reneges on any agreement that he has with Alaric and then goes so far as to hire another group of Huns with the sole purpose of kicking Alaric out. What is notable for this particular action is that for the first time in recorded history, we actually have the name of a Hun king. A man by the name of Uldin. I mean, up until this point, we didn't even realize that the Huns even had a king. But again, the history of the Huns is mostly written by the Romans. Alaric immediately sees the writing on the wall, realizes that he doesn't really have a chance of establishing a home in the Eastern Roman Empire, and so he packs up his stuff with all his men, and they go back to the west. Again, if you go back to that sheet of paper, now you can cross him off on the right side of the page and put him back on the left side of the page. You can understand why my sympathy goes out to the man. I mean, he was basically being used as a ping pong at this point. In the west, Stilicho is of course waiting for Alaric. The two men fight in several battles, and eventually in 405, Stilicho is forced to sign a treaty with Alaric because he has other issues that he needs to contend with. Most important of which is the fact that the Rhine defenses have started to fall apart, and there has been a massive flux of barbarians across the Rhine into Roman-held territory. Stilicho goes so far as to even hire Uldin, again the king of the Huns, to come to the Western Roman Empire in order to contend with this problem. Initially, Stilicho and his new Hun mercenaries are successful. They're actually able to hold back or at least capture a great deal of the barbarians that are crossing over the Rhine. But things start going very badly for Stilicho. In the year 406, you have a new group of people trying to cross over the Rhine. This time, the Vandals, the Goths, and now the Alans are crossing over in ever-increasing numbers, and Stilicho can do very little to actually stop them. I want to emphasize that these peoples that are crossing over the Rhine are actually being displaced by incoming wave of Huns that are coming off the European steppe and slowly making their way into Western Europe. Now, they're not the same group as Uldin. There are already Huns that are actually settled south of the Danube, and some of them are actually in Roman territory, but these are a new group that are actually coming in. It's kind of like this black cloud of doom that's slowly making its way westward. In a certain sense, if you think about it, it almost takes on like a biblical plague-like quality. Now, if trying to keep the barbarians out of Roman territory and on their side of the Rhine is not bad enough for Stilicho, things get even worse. In 407, England and France decide to break off. They secede. A new emperor kind of comes into power up there. And again, Stilicho can do very little. This, of course, angers the emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Honorius, who is also no longer a child. In 408, he has Stilicho rounded up, and then shortly thereafter, he has him summarily executed. Let's talk about Honorius for a second. I challenge my listeners to go out there and see if you can find an article or a phrase or a book or something that actually talks about Honorius in a very positive light. I don't think you're going to find it. This man is regarded almost universally as one of the biggest failures in Roman civilization. Some of his actions go beyond just simple stupidity. They go into that realm of complete and total insanity. And I'm going to give you a good example of this. Now, take into account that most of the Roman army at this point in time consisted of troops that were outside of Italian descent. There were troops inside of Stilicho's army who were the defenders of Rome, who were Goth in origin. What's more, many of these troops had families, wives, and children that were living within the Roman Empire, and that was primarily the reason why they didn't defect or rise up against the Roman army. Shortly after Honorius has Stilicho arrested and then killed, he passes an edict that states that all members of Goth origin are to be executed. This order gets misinterpreted by the Roman court, and before you know it, it's not just the troops that are targeted, but it's also the families of these troops that are massacred. I'm not talking about just soldiers. I'm talking about men, women, and children that were killed, and killed in the very name of Honorius. These very same Goth troops who had served as the very backbone of the Roman army and also the defense of Rome itself have no place else to go. They have to flee from Honorius, and they flee directly into the waiting arms of Alaric. Some sources indicate that approximately 30,000 troops swelled the ranks of Alaric's army. And now he's no longer the small kid on the playground. He's got a formidable army. He's on Italian soil. He is within striking distance of Rome, and he knows it. But Alaric does not want to simply just destroy and pillage everything in his path. What he really wants is a nation-state for his own people, or at least a piece of land within the Roman Empire that can be protected away from the marauding bands of Huns and other groups that are coming off the Asiatic and European steppes. He actually admired the Romans. He admired their accomplishments, and he wanted that for his people. And so he begins negotiations with Honorius in order to accomplish this. But the problem is that he is dealing with a complete and total incompetent. Honorius has this prideful stupidity that he just can't see beyond the tip of his nose. He can't see Alaric as being anything more than a simple barbarian. And so Honorius kind of gives him the runaround. He gives him these fake treaties that he takes back, and eventually Alaric has had enough. He realizes that the only way to convince the Romans of accomplishing anything is going to be at the tip of a sword. And so he marches on Rome. Edward Gibbons, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, I think puts it pretty well. He states, and I quote, "His troops, animated by the hopes of spoil, followed the course of the Flaminian Way, occupied the unguarded passes of the Apennine, descended into the rich plains of Umbria. A lofty situation and a seasonable tempest of thunder and lightning preserved the little city of Narni. But the king of the Goths, despising the ignoble prey, still advanced with unabated vigor, and after he had passed through the stately arches, adorned with the spoils of barbaric victories, he pitched his camp under the walls of Rome." End quote. This was going to be the beginning of a siege that was going to last for several months. Again, Alaric wasn't there simply just to pillage. He was there to establish a negotiated settlement in almost the literal sense of the word. He wanted space for his people to live in. And what better way to accomplish this when you're dealing with a prideful and resenting enemy than to have your sword at their very necks? At least that's what he thought. But negotiations continued to fail. And here's another clip from Edward Gibbons, which actually includes several of the interactions between some of the Roman senators and Alaric himself. And I quote, When they introduced into his presence, they declared, perhaps in a more lofty style than became their abject condition, that the Romans were resolved to maintain their dignity either in peace or war, and that if Alaric refused them a fair and honorable capitulation, he might sound his trumpets and prepare to give battle to an innumerable people exercised in arms and animated by despair. His famous reply was, "The thicker the hay, the easier it is mowed," laughing at the gall of the Romans in their pitiable position. He set the ransom for breaking the siege at all the gold and silver in the city, whether it were the property of the state or of the individual, all the riches and precious movables, and all the slaves that could prove their title to the name of barbarians. The ministers of the Senate presumed to ask in a modest and suppliant tone, "If such, O king, are your demands, what do you intend to leave us?" "Your lives," replied the haughty conqueror. They trembled and retired. End quote. Now, negotiations continued to fail. On August 24th, in the year 410, Alaric had no choice. He sounded his trumpets. His forces marched on the very city of Rome itself. In the book The Fall of Rome by Raphael Lafferty, he has a very good account of this. He states, "At the time, the Salarian gate of Rome was secretly opened by Gothic slaves in the city. The troops of Alaric entered, and their entry was signaled by a giant trumpet blast, such as will never be heard again till the last day. And on the terrible blast of the Gothic trumpet, the world came to its end." Rome was pillaged for the next 3 days. Its gold, its artifacts, its treasures were all boxed up and carted out of the city. But as far as pillaging goes, Alaric was perhaps one of the more benign conquerors. He made it a point to spare the structures and the buildings.